So good evening, everyone. As I had said, hand is a fantastic. Whenever we talk about hand, no, I never stop admiring the beauty of this structure. And burns is another fascinating. And when the two get together, it's a great combination. The best part is that it is very simple to manage. The worst part is that the complications are it's very difficult to manage the complications. It is so easy to manage a hand burn. So I'll dwell more on the acute management and talk about the acute management, and then we'll go to the contractures and all that. Just give me a moment, I'll share my screen. Yep. So management of hand. What is the sadness in this picture? Both hands are like this. They don't look like hands at all. They are absolutely no use to the person except maybe as a support. There is no use at all to these hands. And the worst part is that my professor used to say, Dr. Krishnamurthy, R. Krishnamurthy, he used to say, the worst part of it is that they can't even scratch when they have an itch somewhere in their body. That is because itching is one of the most basic of sensations. But what is the saddest part of this picture is it is totally preventable, 100% preventable. So what this prevention is what we're going to see today. And the interest in hand burns started with Daniel Drake's account of his own hand burns way back in 1830. This article was published in 1998. And Daniel Drake described exactly how the contracture developed in his hand, how the wounds healed. And then we were able to understand what is it that is happening in the hand. So we'll discuss the burns of the hand in two situations, in acute burns and then in late sequelae after burns. In acute burns, the hand is very commonly involved. It comes very low in the priority of management. We are more interested in the life of the patient. Very true. Life is most important. It is life that must be taken care of. But we need to understand, but after giving him the life, what sort of life is it going to be if the hands are like I had showed you in that picture? And as I said, the best part is it doesn't need any major surgical procedure or major procedure to get those hands, to prevent those problems occurring on those hands. Very simple steps, provided we understand what is going on in the hand. So what is the use of life with hands like these? Poor self-esteem will be there. The patient will have to be completely dependent on everything, on his immediate caregivers. He may go into depression. We have seen it very commonly. And he ends up as a burden to society. So acute burns of the hand, I am planning to deal it with the types of burns that can occur in the hand and the features of each particular type of burn, assessing the burn, managing the burn, and emergency procedures and resurfacing procedures. Now, types of burns, the commonest are scalds. Scalds burns due to hot liquids. The wounds are usually superficial. Remember, scalds are usually superficial. The duration of contact is less because they fall off immediately, whatever the liquid. The spill off time is less. And the heat distribution to the skin is uniform. So it's usually a very uniform burn. And the amount of burn depth, we say it is uniform. But uniformly, what thickness? Is it a superficial burn, second degree burn, or a deep burn? It depends on the viscosity of the solution that is hot. If it is water, it is superficial second degree. If it is a thicker liquid like oil or sambar or kanji, which is a porridge, it becomes a thicker. So it will be a deep second degree burn, but it will be uniform throughout. So the depth varies according to the consistency of the hot liquid. The pressure and the latent heat, steam, will cause more amount of depth of burn the scalds than just hot water. The type of clothes that the patient is wearing and the position of the patient. If the patient is supine and hot water, the water stagnates for some time and that causes more amount of burns. Now, usually affects children, commonly hand. Sometimes it affects the face. So scald is the first commonest type of burns in the hand. Second is the flame burn. These wounds usually are of mixed depth. Usually from rescue burns, burns of the hand. They try to save themselves. They try to protect themselves. They try to protect another person. All these cause burns of the hand. So these should be remembered. Third is electrical burns. Now, when I want to talk a little detail about electrical burns. Electrical burns are very interesting. We need to understand them to get on top of them. They have 4 types of injury caused by the electrical burns. The first is flash burns. The second is contact electrical burns. The third is arc burns. And the fourth is flame burns. We'll see each. Before we go into the types of wounds that are caused by electric burns, we need to understand this electric current. A lot of my colleagues ask me a lot of doubts about this. So we need to understand the current is equal to the voltage by resistance. So the effect of the electric current depends upon the current, the voltage, and the resistance. The resistance here is the skin and the tissues, and a few other factors which we will see. We'll first see this current. Among the current, you know there are 2 types of current, the alternating current and the direct current. The alternating current is 4 to 5 times more dangerous than the direct current. First point to remember. It causes more severe muscle contractions. It stimulates sweating, which lowers the skin resistance and allows the spread of the electric current. And among the alternating current, 60 cycles is the most harmful range. And there is something known as a let-go current. That is, when the patient holds the the source, sometimes he is not able to take his hand off. It gets stuck over there. So that is because of the amount of current. The let-go current in alternating current is 22 milliamperes and 88 milliamperes in direct current. If it is more than this, he will not be able to let go. It will hold on. As long as he holds on, the depth is more, the exposure to the current is more, and the chance of fibrillation in the heart is more. Now, the second, we have seen the current aspect of the electrical current. The second is the voltage. Now, you may have an electrical burn like this. Can you see those small points over there? It can be like this, or it can be like this. So what is the difference between these two is that this is a low voltage current, this is a high voltage current. So what is a low voltage? Anything below 500 volts is known as a low voltage burn. It is not enough to cause tissue damage along its path, except at the contact site. So you saw in that patient a small burn on the thumb and a small burn on the finger where the boy touched the electric source. The high voltage burn is more than 500 volts. The damage runs its course throughout the body. So high voltage, low voltage. We have seen current, alternating current is more dangerous. Now voltage, high voltage is more dangerous. Excuse me. Then third, we come to resistance of skin. The other factors I told you, resistance. The third point is resistance. The more the resistance to the current, the more the damage. Because when there is a resistance, there is a heat generation. The current is not able to pass through because there is resistance. When the current is not able to pass through, immediately it generates a lot of heat. The heat generated is proportional to the square of the current and the resistance. Now, the resistance of dry skin is 500,000 ohms per square centimeter. It is so resistant. Current cannot pass through normal skin. It is very difficult. However, if the skin is moist, the resistance comes down drastically to 1000 ohms per square centimeter. And when the skin is breached, either by the break in the epidermis or some ulcer over there, it immediately comes down to only 500 ohms per square centimeter. That leads to current immediately entering the body. The path taken by the current. If it goes from the finger only to the elbow, it doesn't cause any harm. Patient will only have a painful shock, like sometimes we have when we touch some source. If it goes from the hand to the foot, or it goes from one hand to the other hand across the chest, it causes severe effects. That is why whenever you would have noticed some people who are working on transformer, they keep one hand behind their back and they work only with their dominant hand alone. It is not just enough to wear protective footwear. It is important to remember the path of the current should not be allowed to pass from one hand to the other hand. If you work with both hands on an electrical circuit, you are likely to have a more deadly problem. So let us just summarize what we have learned. The type of current, AC or DC, AC is bad. The amount of current amperage more than the let-go current is bad. The pathway of the current, now you know that hand to hand, hand to foot is bad. Resistance of the body, dry skin is more resistant, moist skin is less resistant. And voltage, high voltage is bad. So now we have understood a little about the basics of the physics of the electrical current. We will now see the other aspects in the hand. The first type of injury that you get in electrical burn is a contact. That wire, the person holds the wire, you get what is known as a contact burn. Look at this child. The wire was held in this part of the palm. It is usually charred, centrally depressed. It is typical. It is a full thick. That means when it's centrally depressed, it means it is a full thickness burn in that area. It is leathery in appearance with a black metallic coating from the electroplating of the wire, if it is there. Now, these wounds, you also have what are known as contact wounds on the palm and exit wounds on the feet. These wounds are more likely to explode as the charge exits. So you have more of an explosive wound. Look at this boy. He has got burns on the feet, both feet. On one foot, the toes have become gangrenous because the amount of electricity passing out in a hurry is so much. That was the first, that is contact burn. The second is the arc burn. There is no direct contact to the electrical source. Supposing the patient just touches an electrical wire, you will have burns all over the upper limb. How does it occur? The electrical energy travels from an area of high resistance to area of low resistance. We'll try to understand this. And the circuit is completed when the air particles are ionized. Now, what happens is, now look at this. Now, this is the contact burn. You can make out the child or the patient touch the electrical wire. Okay, now we have understood there is a contact burn over there. What happens to the current? Now, the current wants to go through the body very fast. But the body tissues are going to give a resistance to the flow of the current. Current will flow, but it goes slowly because it has to go through the muscles. And which is the most easiest conductor? We know that water is the most efficient conductor of electricity. And which is the tissue which has the most amount of water? Blood vessels. So it runs through the blood vessels, but even that is not enough for the current because it wants to go faster. So how does it go faster? When there is a large electric current, what happens is the air outside the upper limb, the contact is also ionized. So that itself acts as a medium and the current jumps. The current is going through the limb very slowly, but it also jumps like this to the next area where it is moist. Which area is going to be moist in the upper limb? The wrist. So this is the next moist area. So it runs to the wrist. So you would have seen whenever a patient has an electrical burn, there is usually a burn on the wrist. How is it that the patient has a burn on the wrist when he has not touched the electrical surface with the wrist? This is typically an arc burn. So the electricity jumps to the wrist. Next, it causes a burn over there, a deep burn. From here, again, it jumps again to the next moist area. Which is the next moist area? The elbow, which is usually folded, so it is moist. So that is the least resistance. The current runs till there and causes a burn there. Next, it runs to the axilla. This is the basis of the arc burn. And these arc burns that you see are not superficial, they're quite deep. Next is the flash burns. So we have seen contact burns, we have seen arc burns. Next, what happens is when there is an electrical, when there is a short circuit or something, there is a flash of electricity, something like a lightning. And this causes a immediate burn over the body. And this has a typical, it's usually a superficial second degree burn. It's just a flash over there. And you have this sort of appearance. This is called the filigree appearance or the Lichtenstein appearance. You have this, usually these wounds heal well because they are superficial second degree. So this is the third type of burn that you get, the electrical burns. And lastly, you have the flame burns. When there is a fire, it's called a conflagration. When there is a fire following the electrical short circuit, it burns. When the patient's clothes also burn, you have an additional fire, and this causes a mixed type of burn. And what are the sequelae of electrical burns? Gangrene. You may have gangrene, usually electrical burns. They may present like this in various stages of gangrene. All these are very common, or in pre-gangrene stage. So we'll just see an example. Look at this patient. You can make out, can you see this on the thumb and the little finger? That is the only area where the contact occurred. What happened after that? Heat developed. That is the contact burn. These are the arc burns. Can you see this? It has jumped to the wrist. Then it has jumped to the... Now look at this. Can you make out the difference between this burn and this burn? This is a full thickness burn. It is white in color. This is charred. So this is also a full thickness burn. So from here it jumped here. This is a flash burn. It's a superficial second degree burn. That is a superficial second degree burn. So what happens when you open it, you will find, can you see the muscle necrosis here? Under this area of full thickness burn, the muscle is necrosed. Under this area of full thickness burn, you can make out the necrosis of the tendons and muscle. And here the muscle looks better. So this is a fasciotomy that has been done. And here near the axilla, you can make out more amount of necrosis. Now, we need to understand what is happening in this. How did this amount of burn occur in a patient who just touched the electrical circuit with his thumb and little finger? And then you can note the gangrene has occurred here on the little finger, and you can make out the muscle has necrosed here, the muscle has necrosed here. The typical areas of the arc burn, which are of full thickness depth, has occurred here and over here, and the intervening segment, the muscle is intact. This is what we need to remember. So what is the effect of electricity on tissues? The electricity, I told you, has entered the body and is now running through the tissues. When it is running through the tissues, what does it do to the tissues? We have got what is known as an inverted cone damage. The skin offers resistance. I told you when a tissue offers resistance, heat is generated. So when the skin offers resistance, heat is generated. That heat breaks down the skin and the electricity starts entering. The soft tissues, some tissues conduct the electricity like the blood vessels, which immediately become thrombosed. What happens? The bone offers complete resistance to the electricity. It doesn't allow it to pass. So what happens? It gets heated. So because of the high resistance of the bone, you get a charred periosteum. So till the bone, you have the involvement. So when there's an electrical stimulus over here, the muscle, the vessels, the veins, all these are involved. When it comes up to the bone, it is totally involved. So what should have been like this? Because of the heat generated in the periosteum, the amount of heat, that causes more damage. So it becomes like an inverted cone. So whenever you see a wound like this, you remember that picture that I showed you where there was an arc burn on the wrist? You noted how much of necrosis of the muscle. You noted that elbow raw area, which was quite small, but look at the amount of necrosis of the muscle. This is typically what happens. We have to remember this inverted cone appearance. Now, we have seen scalds, we have seen flame burns, we have seen electrical burns, then we have what are known as contact burns. For instance, when you touch a hot object, now this is usually a full thickness burn because it takes some time for us to take our hand off from that hot object. That amount of time is enough to burn the complete skin. So it is usually a full thickness burn. Next is chemical burns can be caused by different chemicals like acids or alkalis. When a patient presents with a burn on the hand, we need to assess the burn first before we can plan anything. How do you assess the burn? The depth. When you see the depth, you will find that there is a different depth of the thickness of the skin in different areas. For instance, the dorsal skin is quite thin. The amount of dermis is thin. The palmar skin, the amount of dermis is thick. You might have noted when the patient comes with a burn on the palmar aspect, there is usually a big blister. That is because the dermis is thick and the burn, the same burn on the palmar aspect will cause a superficial second degree burn and cause a blister, whereas on the dorsal aspect, it will be a full thickness burn. As I said, the palm and dorsum are different in thickness. Similarly, the palmar aspect of the finger and the dorsal aspect of the finger. Now we come to there is not much about assessment, but as we go through the management of the hand burns, we will understand how we need to manage those burns. When we come to the management of hand burns, what we need to understand are the principles. There are 4 basic principles. Whenever you see a hand burn, these 4 principles must be there in our mind every single time that we see a patient with a hand burn. You may see a patient with a 70% burns involving the entire body, but his hand also would have been involved. You don't have to spend much time about the hand, just these 4 principles. 1. Rapid wound closure. As early as possible, do a burn excision and early skin cover. This must be running through your mind. It is not possible to do it all the time, but always have it in your mind, when can I cover that raw area? When can I remove that burnt skin and resurface with the skin? Because that is the first principle for management of hand burns. Resurfacing the skin with a normal skin. Second, infection control. Infection is going to completely break down all our results. It's going to break down the entire basement of our management. First is rapid wound closure. Second is infection control. Third is preservation of the range of movement. After all, we want to achieve a good functioning hand. So we must keep thinking at the back of our mind every time you see a patient with a burn on the hand, rapid wound closure. When can I close that wound? Second, is there any infection? How can I prevent infection? Third is how to preserve the active and passive range of movements. And lastly, active and passive range of movements refers to the mobilization. Splinting refers to the immobilization. They are like the yin and the yang. Without this, there is no that, and without that, there is no this. So whenever you see a patient with hand burns, these 4 points are what are important. If you are able to manage these 4 points, the hand will be 100% back to normal. And that is what we want to achieve. It's not a big thing. We'll be seeing why it occurs and how it can occur. Now, the whole problem in hand burns, first we have seen gangrene, that we cannot control to a certain extent. We can prevent to a certain extent when we do a fasciotomy or an eschorotomy. Remember, in the last week, we talked about the acute compartment syndrome and how we can do an eschorotomy and relieve it. So that is not a big issue. The whole issue is development of contractures, because you may save the life of the patient who has had burns, but the whole success lies in preventing contractures, especially in the hand. This is what we're going to talk with now. So why do scars and contractures develop? There are 2 main reasons. Secondary healing. Remember, I told you skin cover, and second is mobilization and splinting. The skin cover and infection, if they are not taken care of properly, it leads to secondary healing. Secondary healing is murder for the hand. It leads to contractures. Second, positioning is not good. What is this positioning? Now, this is the position of ease. This is what is known as the position of ease. When you see a patient with a burn, acute burn on the hand, this is how he'll have his hand. There will be edema in the hand. You can see that this is not a very full thick, it's not a very deep burn actually. and he's holding it like this because this is he finds it comfortable in this position. What is happening inside? The stage is actually getting set for stiffness and contractures. Why? This is the position of ease, as I said. Now, as you can see, this is how the patient is holding it. Now, why does stiffness occur? The whole basis of why stiffness occurs, if you can point out one particular problem that is leading to all this, is the flexion at the wrist. So this flexion at the wrist is the basis of all the problems that occur in the hand after a burn. So what is this wrist flexion? Why is it such a big issue? Why is the wrist in flexion at all? You would have seen in both the pictures, examples that I given, that the wrist is in flexion because this is due to gravity. Now, when the gravity is acting, it goes like this. So this wrist flexion, when it goes in for flexion, it leads to compression of the veins which are on the dorsum of the hand. When the veins are compressed on the dorsum, it leads to edema, ballooning of the dorsum of the hand. When the dorsum of the hand balloons due to subcutaneous tissue edema developing, the edema doesn't develop only in the subcutaneous tissue, it also develops within the joints. Which joints? The metacarpophalangeal joints. So it goes into extension, hyperextension. When this goes into hyperextension, the PIP joints go into flexion. Very simple. So if I just take the wrist and keep it into extension, all these problems will come down. If you do just this one step of just giving a splint for the wrist and preventing it going into a flexion, 70% of the hand function can be preserved. Now, isn't that a very simple thing? It's a very simple thing. You don't have to do it yourself also. You tell your therapist, or you tell your resident to just put a POP over there to hold the wrist up in extension. That is enough. That will preserve 70% of the hand function. So what happens if the PIP joint is kept in flexion? When it is kept in flexion, there is a volar plate over here and accessory collateral ligaments. Now, this is the volar plate, and these are what are known as the crura. When the PIP joint flexes, this volar plate, and these are the crura. When it flexes, this volar plate slides downward. When this volar plate slides downward, these crura, you can see those crura become shortened. So when I keep my PIP joint flexed like this, these crura become shortened. In the body, in our human body, whenever a structure is shortened, it tends to retain that shortened position and gets fibrosed in that shortened position. That is why when it is kept like this, even my hand, if I keep it in flex position, a normal hand, if I keep it in flex position for about 4 weeks, 3 weeks, if I keep it like this continuously with a POP on, after 3 weeks, when I take the POP out, I cannot extend my PIP joints. So we need to remember to keep the PIP joint straight. What about the metacarpophalangeal joint? So does that mean we have to keep the metacarpophalangeal joint straight? No, it is the exact opposite of the PIP joint. Here too, there is a volar plate, but the metacarpal joint, metacarpophalangeal joint volar plate is different. What happens is, in extension, this is the collateral ligament in shortened position. In flexion, this is the collateral ligament in lengthened position. I told you in the body, whenever any structure is kept shortened, it becomes fibrosed. So if I keep it in extension, this shortened position, it will get fibrosed. If I keep it in flexion, in this lengthened position, it gets fibrosed. If I keep it in flexion, with the lengthened position fibrosis, I'll be able to extend it later. But if it is kept in extension and it gets fibrosed, I cannot flex it later because the ligament has to lengthen when the flexion at the metacarpophalangeal joint occurs. Now, this may be a little, I hope you've understood it. We will discuss it again at the end of this metacarpophalangeal joint. Now, so this is what I was telling you. It is the collateral ligament is shorter in extension and longer in flexion. So we want to keep it always in the lengthened position So you always keep your metacarpophalangeal joint in a flexed position of 90 degrees. You always keep the interphalangeal joint in extended position to prevent a contracture. And what about the thumb? The thumb is also an important fellow. If you look at those pictures that we saw, the thumb is kept like this. It is kept adducted. Can you make out that? If nobody keeps the hand like this, it always goes into this position. Now, there are important ligaments around the CMC joint, multiple ligaments, of which the two most important ligaments are the anterior oblique ligament and the ulnar collateral ligament. Both are taut in abduction. Remember, both are taut in abduction. Remember, we have to keep the structures taut. Only then there will not be a contracture. So you have to keep the thumb in abduction. So wrist in extension, I told you, metacarpophalangeal joint in flexion, IP joints in extension, and thumb in abduction. This is the abduction that I want to keep. If you are able to keep this, 95% of the hand function you have preserved. With one step, you preserve 70% of the hand function. With these three maneuvers, 95% of the hand function can be preserved. What more do you want? Is this a big complicated procedure? Very simple procedure. Only thing we need to understand why it needs to be done. So who is going to help us now to get back good function? The therapist, the orthotist, because we need to apply splints, the occupational therapist, the psychological counselor, and the social worker. So as we know, otherwise the hand will be rendered totally useless. The metacarpophalangeal joint will go to hyperextension, PIP joint flexed, CMC joint thumb of the thumb is adducted. Surgical correction is not perfect. Don't ever think that it doesn't matter if it goes, no, I'm not going to concentrate on the hand. I'm going to concentrate on saving the life of the patient. Very true. You need to concentrate on saving the life of the patient. But to prevent the problems in the hand, all you have to do is the simple steps that I said, because surgical correction is never perfect and involves a prolonged period of splinting exercises, and after that you may need surgery which may not give adequate results. Prevention is easier, economical, and always results in 100% return of function. So when do we do all this? I told you a lot of things. You can do a splinting like this, you can keep it like this and all that. So when do we do all this? At the beginning. Begin at the very beginning. First, you know, we have the inflammatory phase of burn, the trauma, the burns, the infection, whatever it is. Continue through the proliferating phase and end with the remodeling phase. How to prevent? Treatment of the cause. Of course, the burn you're going to treat. Position, immobilization, mobilization, anti-edema measures, anti-pain, psychological factor. As I told you, the mobilization and the immobilization splints. Whenever you say mobilization, please don't stop with that. Mobilization is not enough. For instance, I'll give you an example. Supposing you tell the patient, please keep flexing and extending your fingers. It will become normal. Not at all. I'll tell you what will happen. The patient will do like this. And after he cannot do it 24 hours a day. Obviously, isn't it? He will do it for about maximum about 15 to 20 minutes. Then he will relax. When he relaxes, what is the position of the hand? He will keep it like this. He will not keep his hand like that. He'll keep it like this. Then what will happen? Again, he'll start mobilizing. Again, he'll keep it like this. Millimeter by millimeter, it will go in for flexion contracture. So, and when he sleeps at night, a minimum of 8 hours if he's going to sleep, it will be in this position. See, the position of ease. And the biggest culprit, the wrist flexion, will come in. So, what you have to do, you can't be with the patient 24 hours asking them to mobilize. So, what you can do, in your absence, something will keep it in a good position. That is the immobilization. The yin and the yang of therapy of hand movements, especially of hand function, is immobilization, mobilization. Whenever you see a patient, think about, can I mobilize? If I mobilize, should I immobilize? How much of mobilization? In the beginning, you want to have more of immobilization and less of mobilization. Towards the end, when the patient is almost becoming normal, you want to have more of mobilization and less of immobilization. So that is what we need to concentrate on. So the position, again, I reiterate, wrist in extension, this is the prime positioning. MP joints in flexion, PIP joints in extension, CMC joint on the thumb in abduction. IP joints, doesn't matter what you keep it. If you keep the CMC joint in abduction, more than enough. So this we have seen already. So here, so what is bad in this? Wrist is in flexion. Number 1 mistake. The MCP joint in hyperextension. Number 2 mistake. IP joints in flexion. Number 3 mistake. And thumb in adduction. Number 4 mistake. So what you need to do, just apply a splint like this. Wrist in extension. First problem corrected. MP joint in flexion. Second problem corrected. IP joints in extension. Third problem corrected. Thumb in abduction. Fourth problem corrected. Now this is just a picture to show when we had a patient, when I was in Kilpauk Medical College, there was a bakery burst. There was a burst of a cylinder in Kodugayur. And about 30 patients were admitted at the same time. And all those patients had hand burns. And this was our orthotist and the therapist who made a splint like this. Very simple to make with POP. They applied it for all the patients. And this was done on the next day. Patients were admitted at 12 o'clock in the midnight. And next day morning, our therapist did a beautiful job. For everybody, they applied a splint and we could get excellent return of function on the hands. So splinting is of two types. It can be continuous or it can be static or dynamic. It could be during the stage of inflammation. I told you in the beginning, the stage of inflammation, there is more of splinting, less of mobilization. Towards the late stage remodeling phase, it is going to be less of splinting, more of mobilization. Now, you also have to give anti-edema measures because when there is edema, patient cannot mobilize the hand. Extremity elevation, compression gloves can be placed. Ultrasound will also help, of course, after the healing. Mobilization, active exercises, you teach them active exercises, and what they should do is ask them to flex. Don't ask them to do this. This does not help anybody. They have to flex it, maybe till this much. Once they flex it till here, they must sustain it at the maximum range. Hold that position for about 5 seconds, then extend. So that will increase the range of movements. Other modalities, they are present, but more of theoretical aspect. What I spoke to you till now was what can be done practically. It doesn't involve any great machines or equipment. All you need is a little enterprise to understand what is happening in the hand. So we have already seen this, when to prevent this during the inflammatory, that is, from the time the patient is admitted in the ward to the time when the complete function is returned, you have to be at it. So what we have learned now, which joints are affected the most? The PIP, metacarpophalangeal joint, CMC of thumb and the wrist. Why stiffness occurs? In the PIP due to volar plate problem, in the metacarpophalangeal joint due to collateral ligament problem, and in the CMC joint of the thumb due to the respected ligaments. Why prevent? If you don't prevent, it's going to be debilitating, loss of function, later osteoarthritis may develop. When to prevent? As early as possible for as long as possible. And how to prevent? Splinting, anti-edema measures. Now, we have seen the basics of management of a hand burn. We have seen how to apply a splint, how to mobilize, and what to take care of. We have also said that you need to resurface the skin early. We shall come to that procedure next. Before that, there may be some, we'll come to the surgical aspect now. Emergency procedures. All through the surgical aspect, please keep remembering the splints and the mobilization, which I told you, whether you do surgery or whether you don't do surgery, doesn't matter. Those principles must be borne in mind. Eschorotomy, fasciotomy, amputations if there has been a gangrene, that is also important. And limb length saving reconstructions. Supposing there has been a gangrene, you have to go much more proximally and amputate, only then you will be able to close the skin, isn't it? You can prevent that by doing what is known as a limb length saving reconstruction. You take it off only till the amputated part and give a flap cover to retain whatever length is there. So we'll see this. We have already seen about eschorotomy last week, so we're not going to go into this now. We have seen fasciotomy also last week. We're not going to go into this now. And whenever the fasciotomy is done, we need to reconstruct early, within 48 hours to 72 hours. The wound caused by the fasciotomy must be closed. Any wound, even after trauma, must be closed within 48 hours. And especially this wound which has been surgically created must be closed. Now this is a fasciotomy after scalps. It has been the skin graft at the end of 48 hours. I'm sorry, the wound at the end of 48 hours has been covered and mobilization started. Now this is a flame burn. You can see the thickness. So after the fasciotomy, what happened? This is the fasciotomy, but we could not close the wound at 48 hours because this wound went in for, this is a full thickness burn. We have saved the hand from going in for gangrene, but this skin has also gone in for necrosis because of the full thickness burn. So we excised it and then we put a graft to get back good function. Electrical burns, you need to, there's a difference here in that. Now look at this arc burn. Remember this, we talked about the arc burn and the amount of necrosis inside. So this will not accept a graft. You need to debride and you need to do a flap cover, whatever the flap. Remember the principle, you need to do a flap cover. So the flap cover has been given. And of course the amputation. Now look at this little boy who presented, you can make out the amount of burn here, you can make out the arc burn here, you can make out the arc burn here. Now we have understood about the arc burn. Now the arc burn here. So what happened? This, you can make out the gangrene over here. So what we did, we said this is all necros, so we did a through elbow disarticulation. And we found that this portion also necrosed. We know that you can make out the arc burn here in the axilla. That means the axillary artery itself is involved. So what happened? This went in for necrosis and we had to do a disarticulation at the shoulder level. So this is another problem in electrical burns. So this is what I was telling you, limb length preserving surgery. Now this patient, this lady presented with a gangrene, epileptic lady, they fall usually, or she fell over an electrical circuit and she had a gangrene of the fingers and the arc burned here. Typical, the amount of necrosis. So we removed this and we debrided this and decided, now this, if you want to close this stump, you will have to do a below elbow amputation. We wanted to preserve her hand because her thumb was intact. So what we did was, we did a double flap. We did a flap here and a flap here. Now, performing the flap is a different ball game altogether. What you need to understand is that you have to preserve it. So we have seen the emergency surgical procedures in burns of the hand or burns of the upper limb are fasciotomy, eschorotomy, then amputations and follow-up of the amputations, and then limb preserving procedures. Now look at this. This is a gangrene, typical arc burn here. We did a above elbow amputation for this patient. Now this muscle is good, the biceps is good, but if you want to close this, you need this. It was good in the beginning, but look at this necros now. Now what do we do now? Can we just remove this muscle? Then we have to remove the bone and do a shoulder disarticulation. We decided to preserve the length, so we did a LD muscle flap, LD myocutaneous flap, and this is what we have done. So actually we used the stump, the remaining skin, but that remaining skin opened up also. So the bone was, can you make out the humerus here? So we took an LD myocutaneous flap and we have closed it. And this is the result. Can you see the result? So we have preserved the length. This is also one of the important principles in upper limb burns. Upper limb burns, fasciotomy you have done, still the gangrene has been controlled, or to a certain level you have restricted the gangrene. But for the remaining length of the limb, you need to cover it. Otherwise it will go in for a very gross shortening. You want to avoid that. So you can give a flap cover. So resurfacing options. we will stop with this. We will not go into the post-burn sequelae like contractures. Those are totally different. I wanted to talk about that today, but that will take a much longer time. We will stop after the resurfacing options. Remember, I told you in the beginning that one of the principles of hand burn management is early skin cover. So when you want to cover the skin of the hand, our aims are to cover the wound. Obviously, you want to cover it. Remember, a flame burn or a scald is only involving the skin. It doesn't involve the underlying structures. To ensure full function, allow for procedures later. To prevent contracture, your skin cover is also going to play a role in preventing contractures. And lastly, it must be cosmetically acceptable. If it is going to be a very bad reconstruction, patient will not use the hand at all. So that also has to be done. So remember, the skin cover that you're going to give must be given as early as possible. I am not saying give a skin cover at 48 hours, give a skin cover in 4 days. I cannot say that because the situation is different for every patient. The patient may be an 80% burn. You can't go there and say, I want to give a skin cover for the hand at 4th day because that is what was taught to me. That is not it. You need to, if you cannot give a skin cover early, no problem. Just apply a splint. Make sure you keep the hand in a good position. You can always do a skin cover a little later, but as early as possible. Now, these are scalds. I told you scalds are quite superficial. They're uniform. They usually heal well if it has been from viscous liquids. Even oil, a little thicker. Kanji is a little thicker. Now this is resurfacing with skin grafts. Now you can make out the small areas of skin grafts here. Then you can also resurface with plantar split thickness skin grafts. Now skin grafts you're taking from the thigh. You can also take split thickness skin graft from the plantar area because it matches. Now look at this. This is not my picture. This is from a book. You can make out the burn over here. This is most probably a contact burn. Only a contact burn will be like this. I told you contact burns are full thickness burns. So what has happened is it has been excised early. You can make out the good bleeding and then it has been resurfaced with plantar skin and look at the result. So this is the courtesy, the picture where I've taken it from, and you can make out the donor site area is healing is also good. Now, can you do full thickness grafting? Yes, you can do. I haven't done so far, but it can be done. And this is also pictures from a textbook. Raw area like this, full thickness grafting has been done. And this is the donor site, usually taken from the elbow crease or the groin crease. Now, the next question is, how do you fix these grafts? Because sometimes burns can be circumferential. How do we fix the grafts? You can apply few absorbable sutures at the corners or few non-absorbable sutures. Aerosolized fibrin sealant can be applied. When you find it difficult, you may be aware that when you're applying a skin graft over a large raw area, it is very difficult to take a bite through the granulation tissue because it will never hold. Granulation tissue is very friable. So how do you take a bite to fix the graft? Nothing to worry about. Use a fibrin sealant which is available. Just spray it over it and apply. And lastly, you can reinforce the edges of the graft with commercially available specialized tape. But more important than all this, preparation of the bed of the raw area is most important. If you prepare the bed of the raw area, you don't have to worry about fixing the grafts. The graft you would have seen, whenever you prepare the raw area, there will be a little amount of oozing. Hold on to it for a few minutes, it will stop. When you apply the graft, due to the capillary action and the fibrin that is there from the bleeding that occurred, the graft will stick. So next time you do a skin graft, just have a look at this. Just apply the graft over it and just gently move your finger over the graft. It will not move if the wound has been prepared well and if there is no fresh bleeding. That is enough. That itself will allow the graft to stick, provided you do a good dressing. So here is, now we talked about skin grafts, we talked about healing on its own, There is no role for secondary healing as far as hand is concerned. Every single secondary healing that occurs will lead to a contracture somewhere. So no role. Either it heals on its own, or covered with a skin graft, or a full thickness skin graft, or a plantar split thickness graft, or if it is deep, you cannot put a skin graft. You need to do with a flap, which can be a regional flap like this, a cross finger flap, or a regional flap like this, a posterior transartery flap, or a distant flap like a groin flap. Why I am showing all these pictures is to tell you that the basic thing is to understand you need to give a flap cover for certain wounds. Now look at this wound. You can make out the skin is burned, full thickness burn of the skin. I told you the dorsum of the skin is more susceptible for full thickness burns, and you can make out it is charred over here. This is an electrical burn. And you can even use distal rare flaps like the paraumbilical perforator flaps. You get multiple flaps in different directions. That can be done. Or you can use combination. Remember, this is the picture of the little child who had a contact burn, who just held a wire. So that is the child. Child has got a raw area on the thumb and on the palm. So we have taken a bilobe flap and another flap from the abdomen, and we have resurfaced these raw areas. First it was bulky, then we have thinned the flaps. Or you can even go up the ladder and resurface with a microvascular flap. Namely, you can do an anteroral thigh flap. So now we have treated an acute burn of the wound wonderfully and discharged the patient. Does he need to come back? Will he come back? Now, a study was done in which they said 7% of the patients have an unmeetable need. They will not come back. Prevalent unmet need is 3%, and 65% is prevalent unmet need. In the example, in the lower middle income group countries. Now, I don't know whether we are the lower middle income or the higher middle income group, but still we understand that this is what happens to our patients. 65% of our patients who are in the lower middle income group will not come back. Why do they not come back? They have got their life to lead on. They have got their work to take care of. The person who is looking after them may have to go to work, may not be in a position to bring them correctly for all the sequelae, for all the splints that you have given splints and sent them, but you have told them to come for review. They cannot come back. We need to understand that. The problem with this is, so what happens to this 65% who don't come back properly for follow-up? You have done a good surgery, no doubt about it. You gave correct splints, you did a correct mobilization, you gave them a good advice to take care of the graft, you told them to wash it correctly, you told them to apply coconut oil, you told them everything, you gave them a splint also. What happens to the 65%? They come like this. That is the sad state of affairs. So now I think I'll stop here, and next week I'll continue this on how to manage these problems, because there is no point in rushing through all this. This we need to concentrate on to get the best results. We have done the best so far for the hand, and still in 65% of the patients, in spite of your best efforts, in spite of my best efforts, this sometimes happens. We have to accept it. It is not that the patient's fault. It is not their fault. It is not your fault also. It is just that it happens in low-income countries. You have to understand that there are certain patient has certain problems. You need to understand. Shall we just answer the questions now? If you have any questions, please go ahead and ask. Sorry. I think there are some questions. I'll just stop sharing my screen.
There are some in the chat box.
Yes, sir. I'll just stop. Yes, sir. I'll just see the questions. What makes the arc burn to jump? How is it different from a high voltage burn? Now, what makes an arc burn jump? I told you the current is passing through the hand. It has entered through the fingers and it is passing through the forearm goes through because it wants to go out somewhere. Where will it go out? It will go out wherever your body is touching the ground. For instance, you are standing without wearing rubber slippers or anything. It has entered your hand and it runs through your feet. When it is going, it realizes it's going very slowly because all the tissues are offering resistance. So it looks for an alternate method to go. Outside the hand, the air is ionized because of the large electric current. So when this happens, the electricity finds an easier way to go. It jumps like that. Now, I don't know if you have seen my video on how a nerve impulse travels in the electrical impulse travels in the nerve. In a myelinated fiber, it doesn't travel like that. It jumps. That is called saltatory conduction. So that is how it occurs. It runs from one least resistance point to the next least resistance point. That is how the arc burn works. The high voltage burn is totally different. In a high voltage burn, you will get an arc burn. So that is how it happens. I hope that answers your question, Dr. Sudhir Ranjan Das. Now, from Dr. P. Ravichandran, sir, good evening. Can you pass K wires to keep the MCP joint in flexion and PIP neutral to prevent contractures? Yes, sir, you can. But what is the problem in doing that is, when there are raw areas, we usually don't want to go through those infected wounds and pass a K wire. A POP is enough. The use of K wires and the use of to keep the MCP joint in flexion and the PIP joint in extension is more useful for management when you are dealing with the contractures. There is no infection. It is all virgin tissue. So there you can use the K wires for the MCP joint and the PIP joint. But usually we don't use it in the acute stage for the hand burns. Splints are more than enough. Now, from plastic, POP will break due to soakage. Better to use water-resistant splints. Very true. POP will break. I showed you those POP which were applied during the Kodungayur burns. Now, that is a stopgap measure. Okay, it is done immediately. You can do it on the table. You see a patient with a wrist. You can't waste time telling, okay, orthotist, please get me a splint to be made. Or you can't tell the patient, go and buy this splint. Before that, just go there, get a POP roll, fold it up, put it for the patient. Enough. See, it is like a person is dying. You want to do something. That hand is dying, is crying for help. That time, as you say, the POP that you apply is going to get soaked. You can always change it tomorrow. Or by tomorrow, you can get a water-resistant splint. That will be better. But a POP does have its place in the management. Dr. Venkatratnam, sir, in case of electrical burns of forearm or arm, for example, how long after the accident the tissue damage of the underlying muscles is expected to continue? That's a very good question. Now, normally what happens is, when it goes, we are always told that the electrical burn, you cannot do a debridement immediately and give a flap cover because the necrosis is going to continue. He has asked a very intelligent question. How long will it continue? The problem is, I can only make a generalization of how long it will continue. Maximum of 2 weeks. By 2 weeks, what happens? Whatever has already necrosed has necrosed. Whatever is not necrosed has got revascularized. As you know, the wound delay, you have heard of the phenomenon of delay. Whenever you do a delay, when you cut the blood supply to a particular area, it gets revascularized in 7 to 10 days. Following that principle, it is about 10 days. However, for practical purposes, when you debride a wound today, for instance, I have done debridement for electrical burns who presented today. Electrical burns this morning came to me in the afternoon. By evening, I debrided. It looks beautiful. Next day, I say I'm going to give a flap cover. I go there and open it. Everything is necrosed inside. That is what will happen. So what should I do now? I debride that and wait. This is called serial debridement. This is an accepted procedure. You keep doing, but remember, when you do a serial debridement, also keep in mind that the vascularity of the hand is also important. You can't keep debriding at the end, take away all the blood vessels to the hand. So serial debridement, but generally up to 10 days to 14 days. After 14 days, there's usually no more necrosis, and whatever is necrosed stays put.
Thank you. Dr. Karthikeyan,
Yes.
can I extend my question?
Yes.
When on the first day, when you are doing a debridement, or second day, when
Yeah.
when you are doing debridement, all the muscles look normal, bleeding, contracting. Why the damage should continue after that? How? What is the mechanism?
Yes, correct. See, the blood vessel is involved. We have understood that the blood vessel is the path taken by the electric current, right? Now, when the blood vessel is involved, okay, if this blood vessel is involved, all the structures supplied by that vessel should have necrosed. Very simple. But it keeps spreading. Why does it keep spreading? Is because when the blood vessel is involved up to a point A, let us imagine the electric current that went through involved the vessel up to a point A. What happens after that? What happens after point A? When the intimal damage that is occurring is further necrosing. So what happens is there is a intimal damage that occurs, which is not very obvious on the first day. Blood flows in the beginning, but by about 2 or 3 days, there is a platelet plug that keeps forming. So that keeps spreading. The platelet plug and the necrosis of the intima keeps spreading. When the intima necrosis, the necrosis spreads and the thrombosis spreads. So that is why we have this sort of spread of the necrosis. Now the main blood vessel has transmitted the electric current. The side vessels have also transmitted the electric current. The amount of damage does not become obvious immediately. For some, the damage is obvious. For some, the damage is much later. This is something like the inhalation burns. Then there is a inhalation of hot air. It causes damage immediately, yes. But that doesn't mean only those alveoli are involved. There are so many other alveoli involved at a subclinical level. They become involved later. This is exactly the reason why we have a spreading thrombosis.
Excellent. Excellent explanation. Excellent. Thank you very much.
Yes, sir. Now, from Joseph Katani, what is the interval which you should wait for before doing a microvascular flap to cover a post-electric burn raw area? As I said, 14 days. Wait for 14 days. After 14 days, even then, see, sometimes, theory is very nice. 14 days it will stop. But when you're doing a microvascular free flap, it is still a little dangerous. I would look clinically. I can plan for a microvascular free flap and I would go as far proximal as possible, even if the vessel looks good near the injury, near the necrotic site in the post-burn raw area, post-electric burn raw area. I would go much more proximally. But after 14 days, to a reasonable amount, you'll be able to do a microvascular free flap. That is my experience in using a microvascular free flap. Now, next is Dr. Sudhiranjan Das. In full thickness electrical burn, is it necessary to manage myoglobinuria? Yes, when the muscles are involved, you look for myoglobinuria. You can make it out typically. The urine will be dark color. When that happens, you need to manage that. As I told you, life is first. If it is a full thickness electric burn, now we have not spoken about electrical burns involving the body or the major electrical burns. In those electrical burns, the amount of fluid that you're going to give is also changing. In a flame burn, you're going to give 3 ml per kilogram per percentage burn. Whereas, if there has been a major electric burn, you have to give 7 ml per kilogram per percentage burn. So, for a 30% flame burn, you're going to give a lesser amount of fluid. For a 30% electrical burn, you're going to give more amount of fluid, especially, and monitor the myoglobinuria. And the urine output must be monitored. I have not dealt with the general management of the burns, but the question about electrical burns, the fluid is totally different. You need to give almost double, a little more than double the amount of fluid to manage the myoglobinuria. Bhagavat, thank you, Bhagavat. Sudhiranjan Das, what is the preferred agent for dressing crystalline or nano silver or anything else? I don't have any preference in this. Collagen you can use for superficial burns, flame burns. When there are flame burns, when there are superficial burns, you can do collagen dressings. If you think it can get infected, or you think that you do not want to keep disturbing the dressings, you're going to give a splint, you can use the nanocrystalline dressings. Silver is nothing but you're going to just prevent infection, that's all. So your alginate dressings, we talked about it last time when we spoke about the wounds. We said if you're expecting a lot of exudation, you need to give hydrocolloid dressings which will absorb the exudate and prevent the strike through. You can use alginate dressings. How do you recommend anticoagulation? If so, for how long? Yes, that is more for major burns. If it is going to be only hand burns, no. Anticoagulation, we give subcutaneous low molecular weight heparin, we give for about 5 days, not more than 5 days, that's all. And we don't generally use topical application. Heparin is sometimes used as a topical application for major burns, but we will not deal with that. Now, when we talk about burns management, we'll talk about that. As far as the hand burn is concerned, subcutaneous heparin will help because it prevents the necrosis, it prevents the clotting, the coagulation that occurs. But in electrical burns, it is not found to be useful. So it may not be useful in electrical burns. But generally, in major burns, we do use anticoagulation. From KK, in case high voltage electrical current with the exit wound of the foot, please explain the exit wound foot management. Okay. Exit wound, I told you, is very important. First thing is you must realize that there is a problem and look at the feet, whether there is any obvious injury or not, exit wound or not. Sometimes it may not be very obvious. If there is gangrene, you have to remove the toes. It's not a big issue because the patient will have his feet. If there is necrosis of the skin, you need to resurface. The dorsal skin and the plantar skin, they are two different ball games. The dorsal skin you exercise, you can wait, put a graft. There is no hurry. As far as the foot is concerned, there is no hurry. Because it is not function. It is only for stability and support. So you can wait, you can put a skin graft. If it is involving the plantar aspect, then you may have to give a better skin cover. A skin graft may not be able to bear his weight in the long run. You may have to give a flap cover, in which case we usually do a muscle flap and a skin graft. We have had patients who have had the entire sole of the foot going in for gangrene. We have done a latissimus dorsi muscle flap and put a skin graft on it. The muscle flap gives a good padding and the skin graft is quite stable. Of course, we have to follow it up with good footwear. So that is how we manage the exit wounds on the feet. Can you comment on the technique of harvesting plantar skin? I told you that is not my case, but still plantar skin, we take it from the instep. You know the instep with the curved upward, that is the medial aspect. You take one pass with sometimes we do a palmar skin graft for small raw areas. You take one pass with the skin graft, you will get a corny layer. It's almost transparent. Keep it aside. Don't use that. Take another. Sometimes it will be so thick, you will get two corny layers. That is the keratin alone, the epidermis. Keep that also aside. When you take a thin graft and find it is white in color totally, that is the dermis. Take that and put that over the raw area which you want to cover. And over the donor side, put back that epidermis that you took as the first layer. We usually call it, when you take it from the palm, we call it the second layer palmar graft. Here also in the plantar aspect, only thing it may not be second layer, it may be the third layer. So, but remember, put back that epidermal graft that you took in the beginning over that raw area after taking away the third layer. Can you comment? Yeah, that's the same thing. If the dorsum is involved, can a skin substitute with incorporated dermis be used? I think, Joseph, you're thinking about Integra. Yeah. I suppose it can be used. I have not used it, and I do not know whether it's a theoretical question whether we can use it. Skin graft is so cheap, and Integra is so expensive. I am not saying it is a wonder dressing or a wonder treatment which can cover small raw areas, but because of the the most expensive material that is supplied, you find it difficult to use it for large raw areas. That's the only thing. If Integra is available very cheap, maybe it's a good option. I have never tried it. I do not know whether it will work for large raw areas. For small areas, definitely I have seen it working. But for large raw areas, I'm sorry, I do not know. And is NPWT contraindicated post-electric burn raw area? I don't know exactly why we need to do an NPWT, because in a post-electric burn raw area, you need to give a flap cover, because an electric burn always causes a full thickness burn, almost up to the bone that we have seen. So you have to give a, maybe what you're thinking of is to improve the granulation. Yeah, and get the patient early for a surgery. I think that's what you mean. Yes, you can. There is no contraindication. The only contraindication we can think of for NPWT is infection, florid infection and ischemia. Impending ischemia of the upper limb may be contraindications. But if the vascularity is good, after 14 days, I don't think there is any problem. You can, but you can use it only to improve the quality of the wound. But ultimately, you're going to give a flap cover. Maybe NPWT will help in the improving the, hastening the procedure. Thank you. Can we use skin from skin bank? Yes, we can use skin from skin bank. Please remember, when you use the skin from the skin bank, it is a totally temporary thing that you are doing. It is not permanent. It will not stick to the patient's raw area. It will get rejected, or you have to remove it, because it is after all a foreign body. It will be rejected. But in the time that it is getting rejected, it will improve the quality of the granulation tissue. You can have a good granulation on which you can apply a skin graft. As far as the hand is concerned, because the amount of skin required is less, it would not be a big problem. I would have expected a question whether when there is what is the priority for hand reconstruction when you compare to the rest of the body. The hand is one of the highest in the priority as far as skin cover is concerned. So there, skin cover, when you have very little skin graft areas, I would take that autologous graft, that is autogenous graft. For instance, a small area of the thigh alone has been spared. I would use that skin for the hand rather than the other areas. I would put the skin bank skin on the other areas, and then maybe in the second round, when that wound has healed on the thigh, I would take a skin graft again and put it on that area. I would give priority for the hand. Bhagwat Kumar, I have used NPWT for foot exit burns with better results than primary SSG. Great. Yes. Any more questions? That was interesting. I mean, hand is always interesting, as I said, and burns is also interesting. When the two get together, it's really fascinating. And as I say, when I see a patient, for instance, when I used to do rounds in Kilpatrick Medical College when I was there, I would see a patient like this and tell my therapist, I had wonderful therapists there. I would call one therapist and tell them, look, this patient's hand is your responsibility. If you can make this hand functional, I don't need you to work again in this. You don't have to take much effort at all. That is a successful therapy. Similarly, when you have a raw area on the hand, I tell a surgeon, if you can resurface this hand and make it successful, you are an excellent plastic surgeon. No questions at all will be asked. Yes, any more questions, or shall we close? Sir?
Anyone from the audience, please?
Hello, good evening, sir. I have one question.
Yes.
When we are giving the splint, we keep the PIP joint straight because otherwise there will be shortening of the volar plate.
Yes.
Whereas we are keeping the MCP joint in the flexion. So the shortening will happen also there in the MCP.
Yes. See, because of lack of time, I'm glad you have been listening. Now, the volar plate of the PIP joint is different from the volar plate of the metacarpophalangeal joint. Okay. Now the PIP volar plate, PIP joint volar plate is a fibrocartilaginous structure. It is quite thick. I don't know if you have seen it, and it will not bend. Okay, so it can only glide downward. Now, if I had time, I could have explained about how beautifully the PIP joint volar plate moves. It glides along what is known as an assembly line. So when it flexes, the volar plate glides. It cannot fold. It only glides down. Whereas the metacarpophalangeal joint volar plate is much thinner, and it has got what is known as a concertina effect. So it's like a fan, you know, it just folds like that harmonium or something like that. It folds, you know. So this can fold like that. So it doesn't play a big role in the metacarpophalangeal joint, whereas the PIP joint, that volar plate is very thick. So that is why there is a difference in the anatomy and the pathophysiology of the contracture development in the PIP joint and the metacarpophalangeal joint. The basic point is that the PIP joint volar plate is thick, almost like hyaline cartilage, and the metacarpophalangeal joint volar plate is fibrocartilage, which can fold. It is compressible and collapsible. Does that answer your question, Rajesh?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Thank you, sir.
Would you prefer, there's another question, will you prefer autologous thick graft rather than thin skin graft? Yes, yes, I would prefer a thick graft. But the problem with thick graft is the take of the graft may not be good. So if the raw area that is there on the hand is good and there is no infection, which can be proved with a quantitative analysis of the bacterial, of the wound swab, then I would do a full thickness graft. Thick graft. But usually it is, because it is a raw area, it is potentially infected. I would not do a thick graft. I would do a thin graft. A thin graft, as I can understand your implication. When you put a thin graft, you can get a good graft take, but the contracture will be more. Whereas with a thick graft, your graft take may not be good, but contractures will be less. But please remember, with a thick graft, if your graft take is not good, you're going to have secondary raw areas which will heal by secondary healing. That is bad. When you put a skin graft, thin skin graft, you're going to have a secondary contracture, which is also bad. So there is bad in everything. But when you put a thin split thickness graft, you can at least try your splinting. But when you do a thick graft, if the graft take is not good, you'll have to do another surgery. That was for Dr. Sudhir Ranjan Das. Okay, so now you're clear about the acute burns of the hand management. So I can see all beautiful hands. Okay. Sir, we can close.
Have you gone through all the chat box questions, sir?
Yes, sir. I think I finished all.
Okay, fine. But they're pretty exhaustive, I think. As usual.
Thank you, Ravichandran, sir. I hope I answered your question about the KYS. Thank you, sir.
So I think at another interesting session, and I think it's only half done. You have
I have got another half. That is more interesting.
Thank you so much, sir, for a lovely evening.
Good night, sir.
Have a great week ahead. Thank you. I shall close here.